In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at multicam editing in Resolve 14. And in particular, we're going to look at the Proxy workflow, where we take Proxy media and we reconform the timeline into Proxy to make it easier to edit. Now, I have a pretty slow machine here. I have done a tutorial earlier that looked at this using Resolve 12.5, and part of that workflow doesn't work anymore, at least not at the present, which is 14.0.1. So we're going to look at that workflow with slight mods so that it works under Resolve 14. So let's have a quick look at it. I have four camera shots here. Cameras 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is actually XAVC L from a Sony X70 camera. I'm just going to bring those in to my media pool here into a bin I've named source. I also have a proxy bin here. And you may recall, if you've seen the other tutorial, that I took these and I used the media management tool to transcode these to a proxy media. And we'll do this now. And then we'll use that proxy media to build up our multicam timeline. However, before we do that, let's take a look at why I'm doing this in the first place. As I say, I have a fairly slow system here. Before I make a multicam clip out of this, I thought the first thing I'll do is enter in angle names for each of these clips, because it makes it easier to sort these out afterwards. In the previous tutorial I did, I actually used the file names themselves, and they've been named in such a way that they will order themselves, but there's another way to do that, and I'll show you that now. So by showing the metadata here, specifically the angle. So for camera 3, I'll just put in angle 3, camera 4, angle 4, camera 1, angle 1, and camera 2, angle 2. I'm also going to set the multicam up to have the same time code as the source clips. All of these actually have the same time code. You don't have to do this, but this is just demonstrating another aspect of this workflow. So I'll make sure that I'm at the just hit the home key and make sure I'm at the very beginning of this clip. You can see that the start time code is 14:25:35:14. And I'll just copy it from the clip attribute. Now I'll make my multicam clips by selecting all the clips, right-clicking, new multicam clip using selected clips. And before I do anything here, I'm going to paste in, just copy and paste in the start time code. As I say, you don't have to do this, but it can make things a little bit easier if you ever have to go back and try to pull from your source media and insert in a much later stage in the edit process if you try to insert additional camera angles. You'll see why that might be required a little later on in this tutorial. Now, rather than sequential angle name, I'm going to use the metadata angle that we set up. I'm not going to move this around. I'll just create the clip in this bin for now. There we go. Now, just double click on that and you can see angle 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when we work with proxy media, I'm going to use the same approach to ordering the clip angles. Okay, so let's look at why I was doing this in the first place. I'm going to take the multicam clip and just simply create a new timeline. There are no marking outs. So in order to edit multicam, you put the source viewer into multicam mode. And in this case, I only want to edit the camera angles. I'm going to leave the audio track to be from camera 1. They actually, all 4 clips have the same audio track. This was mixed down in a studio afterwards, so I created these 4 clips knowing that they were already synchronized. So clicking on simply the video angle, and then we start to play back. So I'll hit the space bar to play back, and as it's playing, I'll try to cut to the music, and you'll see immediately the problem as the 4 camera angles and the record monitor over here all choke. Yeah, you really can't cut to this at all. The timing of this as you were listening to the music trying to cut, it's impossible. So I'll just hit the space bar to pause again. So I'm going to just delete that timeline. And in fact, in this revised workflow, even this multicam clip is not required, but I can leave it here for now, just as a reference. So what I'd like to do here is make some proxy media, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at how to make the proxy media. You can look at the previous tutorial if you're interested. But I will select the clips, and then in media management, under transcode, you see clips is automatically selected. I'll select a destination. I already had a proxy folder set up, the 4 clips, and then I'll use a QuickTime wrapper, but I'm going to select a fairly low bandwidth. This is a 36 megabit per second, but I'm going to leave the 1080p resolution of my original clips. And the reason for this is that if I change the resolution with the proxy media, there are certain things that you'll do in proxy that don't translate well when you actually switch back to your full resolution. So this, if you're working with 4K, this could actually be a little bit of a problem, but even with 4K, you can get much better playback from doing a DNxHR in low bandwidth as compared to your source file, so it should work there as well. So I've seen certain things that, honestly, this is more like it's a bug in Resolve, but things that will, in this tutorial that we'll use, would be things like dead pixel fixer, which is fixing a pixel on the screen relative to your video. And if you're working with a smaller frame size, and then you actually reconform to your source media, you'll find that the dead pixel fixer actually shifts its location, and so it's not really doing its job. So this is why I'm going to make sure that even with my proxy media, I'm going to use the same frame size as with my source media, which in this case, as I say, is 1080p. But I'm going for a much lower bandwidth requirement here with 36 megabit. You can see that actually the size is not much smaller. So the biggest problem is that the XAVC footage that I have from source is a long GOP footage. So it takes a lot more effort to decompress during the multicam editing process. So really just go for the DNxHD because it's an iframe codec. Very easy to play back. I won't bore you with watching the progress here, but we'll simply start this up. And we'll be back in a moment. Okay, so I placed the proxies here. You can see with the metadata inspector, this is now DNxHD. It actually says it's 45 megabit per second, which probably makes sense given that it's 1920 by 1080. Okay, I'll select all 4 of these, and this time I'm going to bring it into our proxy bin here. And you notice these are MOV files, MOV. That's a wrapper for the DNX in this case. So again, let's put the angles in. So this is angle 4, angle 2, 3, and 1. So 1, 3. I'll just copy that over. So again, right click on the selection, new multicam clip using selected clips. paste in the start time code again. Something I didn't mention when I did this before, so we'll use the metadata angles. I'm not going to move the clip. We'll just create it in this bin for now. These media files were actually pre-synced using a sync map, and that's at the same point that I created that media. I also embedded the studio audio from it rather than the camera audio. All four of these have exactly the same start point, and they have already been pre-synced. So I could, in terms of angle sync, I could actually say use sound, which would take a little bit of time, but in theory these would sync up perfectly. But because I know the start time code is already synced between them, I can just use endpoint. However, when you do this, make sure you don't actually have an endpoint set in any of your media. Or if you do, make sure that it's the synced point. I've made that mistake before where I accidentally had an endpoint marked in one of the files, and then of course things didn't sync up very well. Okay, so enough of that. Start time code multicam. We're going to sync on the endpoint, which happens to be the start of those files. We're using the metadata that we just set up for camera angles, and we'll create this. And there's our multicam clip. Now we can double click on that and just verify that we have the right angles. The fourth angle was actually done with just an SLR. Angle 3 was a GoPro, and then we had a couple of other fixed cameras. Now the DSLR had what many DSLRs have, which is some dead pixels, and we'll take a look at that as we move along here. The other thing you can do, just to double check these, is you can right click and say open in timeline on the multicam clip. And this is kind of cool because this shows you actually all four cameras with their respective audio. Turn audio linking on so you can see camera 4, 3, 2, and 1, and you can see that they've all lined up. And then when you want to step back out again, you just double click on, usually you're stepping in from a timeline, double click back out again. Okay, this is great. We've got some nice multicam here, which should play through fairly quickly. So I'm going to create a timeline from our multicam clip. New timeline using selected clips. And I'm going to set the timeline to the same time code, same start time code as the media itself. And this will allow me to go into the media pool and take a specific point in time in any of my media clips and know exactly where it belongs on this timeline. Now, you don't have to do this, but as I say, this can be convenient, especially if after the fact, when you've done what's called flattening your multicam clip, where you basically detach it from the multicam and it's now back to the original media. When you do that, and you need to then come back in and add some media from one of the camera angles later on, you can actually use this time code to figure out where it belongs. I won't use any mark in and outs because I want the whole thing. I'll just hit Shift Z or Shift C for my American friends. And we'll select the multicam tool. So now we've basically ganged our camera angles with the angle that's on the timeline. And I'm just drag through, and this drags through much smoother than before. So again, I can hit the space bar. And now we actually could cut to this. And you can cut using your keyboard, or in this case, I'm just using the cut tool to click on the particular angles. Well, it's a pretty lousy multicam cut, but you can see what I'm doing here. And I'm able to cut it to the timing of the music, in theory. Maybe not during this tutorial, but in theory that's what you can do. And the reason I'm able to do this is because I'm working with those proxy clips. Now, in the previous tutorial that showed this, I was able to re-conform what's called re-conforming, which basically is taking the clips that you see on the timeline and relinking them to a different set of media. So I was able to re-conform back to the original source media directly in the multicam clip. And for some reason in Resolve 14, that doesn't seem to be possible any longer. So I'm going to show you what we can do now with that. But before we do, I want to take a little detour into something that's really rather interesting that you can do also, specifically when you're dealing with multicam. Notice that you can actually open in Timeline. And what this basically does is we're stepping down into the multicam, which, as you can see, is the entire, hang on, Shift C. Okay, we're looking at the entire multicam. This is proxy media, remember. But we've stepped in from the timeline into the multicam clip. And from here, we can actually go over and do some color grading, for example. So this might be a case where you're trying to color grade the multicam so that the individual clips that show up later on, once you've done the edit, will all have at least a primary grade applied to them. Now, these are all stacked on top of each other, so you can't see them. You can see them if you open up the mini timeline. You can see that they're stacked, and that the fourth angle is actually on top of all of them. And you could turn off the top, for example, to expose the third camera, and turn off the third to expose the second, and so on. But you don't have to do that. I'm going to hide the mini timeline for now. There's this little feature here. You can unmix. When you unmix, now you can look at whichever clip you're interested in and not be restricted to the stacking order on the timeline. So you look at something like the GoPro footage here. Clearly needs to be darkened up a little bit, and its highlights are perhaps too high. And then you look at something like the this footage here. If we come into this, it actually has a slight color cast, and it also could stand to be darkened up a little bit, and maybe have some of the color cast removed. You know, you play around with this. That is not a very good removal of color cast, but you can see how you can play with each, and really this is just for demonstration purposes. But this guy's gone crazy with the gain here, and it looks like it has a bit of a cast as well. I'm not going to spend the time now to try to get these all matching each other, but better to white balance your cameras before you shoot, but if you don't, you need to do it here. The point is that I'm making this change as a primary grade on each of these clips. But remember, I'm doing that inside the multicam. So we've ducked down into the multicam. And the other thing you can do here, if we take a look at this, let's see if I can actually zoom in on this a little bit so we can see it. This is a good example of a dead pixel right there, which you can see is fixed in the frame. There's actually a couple of these on here, but that one's pretty easy to see. So we can click on our effects library right here and search for dead pixel fixer, which I'm going to drag onto this fourth camera angle that has the problem. And I'll go into the inspector, over to the dead pixel fixer, into the OpenFX. Make sure you have your OpenFX overlay selected, and I'm going to make this much larger. You can see Just place it over and I'll hide this. You can see that it has smoothed that right out. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And you know, as you're moving through, of course, we're not seeing the dead pixel because it's fixed on the screen under that little hide. You can see here that it's hidden. There's a whole lot of blocking there. And again, remember, we're working with the proxy media. Now remember, I mentioned earlier that when we made the proxy media, we made it to exactly the same frame size as our source media. And it was specifically because of this effect. If you don't have something that relies on the physical positioning, so if you're not, actually this, I think this applies to their masks as well, that it can get screwed up if you're actually shifting frame size. So you have to be careful with that. Try your workflow. Whatever you're doing, make sure you prototype your workflow basically and make sure it works. I found this particular problem the hard way. I had used my original proxy media, which was actually a much smaller frame size to give me even better playback in Resolve 12.5. But when I applied the dead pixel fixer and then switched to when I reconformed to my source media, it was effectively the fixed pixel was in the wrong location now. And it didn't do its job. So here we are. This is very cool now. We've made a primary coloring and we've fixed the dead pixel at the level of the multicam. So as we cut this particular camera angle onto our multicam edit, it will actually automatically have the dead pixel and the primary grade. So let's come back out. I'll just double click on the timeline here to step back out. And let's fit that. And you can see that we actually have those modified grades here. Maybe if I zoom in a little bit here, you can see, if we take a look at this. I'm going to zoom in again and you'll see that the dead pixel is hidden. So it's all happening in underneath on the multicam tracks, both the primary grade and the dead pixel fixer. Okay, sorry for that detour, but I thought it would be worth having a little look at that. So I'm going to Shift Z, see the whole timeline again. Now, if you watch the previous tutorial, you'll recall that I selected the entire timeline at this point and I turned off this, they've renamed it for Resolve 14, but basically turning off the conform lock, which will allow us to reconform the timeline. Now, this doesn't work the same way in Resolve 14. So what I do now is I make a copy of the timeline. I'll just Control or Command C, Control or Command V, make a copy. I'll call this flattened. Make sure you actually double click to open flattened. You can also do that with this little drop menu here. You can switch between timelines. And I'll select with Control or Command A to select all of it. And if I right click, I can say Flatten Multicam Clip. And this will, what this does is it actually takes us out of the realm of multicam and replaces each one of these multicam cuts with the particular camera media. Again, this multicam was made from proxy media, so I'll get the proxy media replacement. So let's do that now. I made a copy of this timeline in case I have to go back. I can make a mistake at this point very easily and screw something up. So rather than that happening, I make a copy of it so I can protect my work a little bit. So just as an example, if I take a look at finding this clip in media pool, which is the camera 1 angle, you'll see that it found it in the proxy pool for camera 1. So this is the tricky additional step that you have to do now with Resolve 14. Sorry, I've got to show you this. This is the best part. You will find that on this timeline, that each of these, if you watch the little dials down below, you'll see that each of these actually has a primary grade. So I've flattened it, and now it has the grade still that I had created underneath the camera angles. And if I look at a clip like this one from camera 3 over on the edit page, you will see in the inspector that it has the OpenFX dead pixel fixer. So these, once this is all cut up, these are basically independent effects now, and as are the grades. So for camera angle 3, for example, every instance of camera angle 3 now is going to have its own independent dead pixel fixer. And you can see I could turn this off, and we will see the dead pixel right there. Turn it back on again, and it's hidden. So this can save you a lot of time to do your primary grade and little fixes like this when you're working in the multicam. Okay, so now with the primary grade and little effects like dead pixel fixer applied, we've flattened the multicam. So we've basically locked in now. But you'll see the timeline timecode is set up to mimic the timecode of the proxy files themselves. Okay, so finally we're at the point where we want to reconform to our source media. So I'll Control or Command A in the timeline to select all the clips. I'll right click and I'll turn off the conform locking. You can see the little symbol in here. Let you know that each of the clips has the conform locking turned off. If I zoom in here a little bit, you'll see it on each clip. So in the media pool, right click on the Flatten Timeline, and in the Timelines submenu, we select Reconform from bins. The first thing we want to do is deselect all of our bins and only have the source bin selected. So we're telling it to go and look at the media files that are within this bin. We wanted to base it on timecode, but we also want to base it on file name. But recall that when we did the transcode, we went from MXF files to MOV files. So we want to say loose file match so that it will try to conform the MOV files to something of the same file name, but potentially with a different file extension. I don't need to note the extension here. I can simply set this up and click on OK. Now, if we select one of these clips and find it in the media pool, lo and behold, it's finding the source clip. What's very cool about this is that if you look in the inspector, you can see that the dead pixel fixer is still applied to this clip. Just zoom in here a little bit. Here's the dead pixel, if you look closely. Wonderful. Let's go back to fitting the image to the viewer here. So that's very cool. And as I have said a couple of times now, if I had used a different frame size for my proxy media, this particular part of the workflow would not have worked. So this is why I use 1080p with 1080p. If I'd had 4K, I would have had to use a 4K proxy. It's not a disaster, obviously. You can very easily, with Resolve, you can copy the OpenFX settings from one clip and apply it to a range of other clips with the paste attributes function. So there are lots of tools to ease the burden if you find yourself working with a different frame size for your proxies. So it's not a big deal. And at this point, you could switch over to your color page, do your final grades, your secondaries, whatever it is you're doing, give it a final look. You can see that each one of our clips has its primary that we set up when we were working with Proxy Media. I should point out that Resolve 14, at least the studio license, seems to play back these files much faster. So in my original tutorial on exactly the same hardware with 12.5, I wasn't able to use proxies that were at 1080p, which is why I went down to an SD frame size. But in 14, and as I say, at least with the studio version, it seems to be quite a bit snappier. Still not good enough to play the original source media as a multicam, but it plays the 1080p proxy media much better. So I think I'm going to finish this up, and I'll try to edit this down a little bit. Hopefully I can make it shorter than it feels like it's become. But thanks for watching. I hope that this modified approach with Resolve 14, hope you find it useful. Bye for now.